Hello from New York. I'm Chris Hayes here with Robert Wolf, former president of UBS Investment Bank and now an outside advisor of President Obama. Thomas Frank, author of Pity the Billionaire, now out in paper book. Maya Wiley from the Center for Social Inclusion. And Garance Francaruta from The Atlantic Magazine. Joining us this morning from East Hampton, New York is Emil Henry, former assistant Treasury Secretary in the Bush administration and a fundraiser for and economic advisor to Mitt Romney. Emil, just... I don't want to litigate the campaign stuff. We could do it off air, but the analysis from Sunlight Foundation just through June 30th, 2012 for this year, all contributions, including industry employees and company PACs, finance, insurance, real estate, or fire is the largest sector by far, 15%. Labor is 3.2%. That's just through June 30th of 2012. So just to sort of clear that away. But here's
you're right. You're right, Chris. It's 30 seconds. You're right, and what I said was historically,
right.
And it's true. You know, John McCain, I think he raised a total of $237 million in that campaign. It wasn't good, and the unions were huge money in that. But I don't want to sidetrack us on the union thing. I'm just reacting to this transactional comment.
Yeah, let me ask you about this transactional thing though, because actually, I keep reading these articles that I've read 15 varieties of the article. And it's about the fact that Wall Street has switched from Barack Obama to his opponent, right? Barack Obama
very much so
raised more money on Wall Street than his opponent last time around. That's established. I think we all agree, right? Stipulated to that fact. And now that's not the case. Wall Street has shifted. And then there's a bunch of stories. Why is that? Why is it the case that Wall Street has shifted? And one of the things I've heard is that Barack Obama is terrible at doing this kind of transactional politics, that he hasn't done sufficient donor maintenance, that people can't get their calls returns, they don't get invites to Christmas parties, they don't get cards, etc. So I keep hearing this story about how bad he is and how good Mitt Romney is at donor maintenance. Emil, is Mitt Romney good at donor maintenance? I guess my question.
Say that again, Chris.
I said, is Mitt Romney good at donor maintenance?
Well, he's fabulous. He's a wonderful people person. But that's really beside the point. I think Bob said let's get a couple of things clear. First of all, Wall Street is all the numbers that I've seen suggest that Wall Street now has shifted in a breathtaking way to Governor Romney. My read of why that's the case, and I've been to so many meetings I can't describe them. My read is that the Wall Street community sees that our economic situation is so dire, and they see the gravity of the situation. They see the parallels that exist between where we are today and where we're headed and where Europe is. And that community thinks that this president is not addressing those,
right,
with over $1 trillion in deficits every year, with $16 trillion of debt. You guys have talked about this ad nauseum, with regulations that are literally stifling growth and banks not lending, et cetera. These are largely a function of this president's policies, and the folks at the center of the financial world are seeing those very clearly.
Bob, I wonder if you want to respond to that, because I mean that's
do we have an hour?
There's a book here. There's a book here. Listen, Pity the Billionaire.
Yeah,
I'm crying for this poor man. This is exactly what I'm describing. Right. Why anybody would want to go the route of Spain, Italy, and Greece, slam us into austerity. I don't get that. I've just come back from Germany. I mean, it's a disaster in the making over there. This would be a terrible thing.
I think Emil's confusing a bunch of things. One, a lot of Wall Street's for Dodd-Frank, okay? And I was there the 3 days at the Fed, the Lehman weekend. We need new rules. They haven't been in existence since 1933. So Dodd-Frank's a good thing, okay? I liked it better than when it was 85 pages.
Let's talk about
Let me just finish.
Yeah.
Thank you. When we talk about the fundraising side, listen, there's part of Wall Street that's for the president, there's part that's against. But when it talks about business, okay, for every person, the Republicans can mention Trump and we can mention Buffett. They can mention someone else. We can mention Tony James, the CEO of Blackstone. I mean, there's plenty on each side. I think business is doing better. I'm not sure what country we're talking about. And when we talk about deficits, I know that Congressman Ryan talks about being a fiscal hawk. He approved both wars. He approved Prescription D. Right. He approved TARP. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the Republicans brought in this fiscal aspect.
That's what they always do that. That's the plan.
Let's just talk facts.
Amy, I'm going to let you jump in, but I want to get to Maya and Garance right at the table. Just
two quick points. So one is the picture of Wall Street, I think, is more complex than anyone's talking about. I mean, in the New York Times piece blaming Valerie Jarrett for the reason that Wall Street was not cozying up more to Obama, and I think George Soros was named in that article. And, George Soros went in, and of course in 2008, having been a huge donor and really asking for some much more radical financial reforms than the Barack Obama administration actually. There's this sort of, they didn't do what he asked, and therefore he's not funding them. I mean, the truth is he made a calculated decision to fund grassroots efforts as what he thought was a much more strategic approach to democracy building. So some of this is much more complicated. The second point, I think, is this, I think it is true that how you handle donor relationships matters dramatically, and every single person who fundraises knows that if you don't stay in touch with your donors,
who are we kidding?
They don't keep giving you money, and that it's not necessarily as ideological or as prescriptive about your policies as it necessarily appears.
Garance.
Yeah, no, that's just manners, I think. But I think one of the things we're probably witnessing this cycle is the end of a certain kind of Republican populism. Yesterday was the 60th anniversary of Nixon's Checkers speech. Right. We've come a long way since, Pat Nixon's respectable Republican cloth coat. Right. And now, we're seeing the end of Republican anti-elitism.
Oh, wait. You're seeing the end of one form of it, the culture wars form, but you're seeing a different form. I mean, the rallying cry in 2010 was out with the ruling class. This is Richard Viguerie had an election day watch party called Out with the Ruling Class. There's this best-selling book called The Ruling Class. This is that Paul Ryan talks about crony capitalism and how much he hates it. It's very much an anti-elitist message. It won't have anti-elitist effects, but it's a different anti-elitism.
But that's all, I think, coming from the Tea Party, and the anti-crony capitalism message is something that Sarah Palin pioneered. The idea that we need to be taxing everybody in the country, including people who have very little money, is something Michelle Bachmann has been pushing for. And I think that's the kind of message that's
can I just talk about that tax situation?
Let me actually want to ask Emil, because I think one of the things that in the tape, I'm curious if you two things that get said a lot. One is, I wonder do you worry about this makers-takers dynamic, that people aren't paying enough income taxes at the bottom? And do you also feel, I mean, the sense I've gotten, I've talked to people on Wall Street in the course of my reporting and watching the video, besieged or attacked or persecuted by the current administration?
Well, let's see. I'm going to answer your question. In your opening statement, which I found really interesting, and I listened very closely to, you said one of the things that you found interesting about that tape was the inanity of the questions. And I just have to say, I'd love to have a tape out at George Clooney's mansion out on the West Coast.
I will concede that. Absolutely. No. Let me be very clear here. Let me be very clear here. Inanity of donor questions is not a partisan issue. I have been in rooms with Democratic donors asking equally dumb and inane questions. Just so that's clear. Continue.
Okay. So I wanted to make it all fair and balanced.
That's not partisan. That I agree with.
Okay, no, but do you? I heard Bob.
Do you worry about this?
I heard Bob say. Go ahead, Chris.
Sorry. Do you worry about this this makers takers issue? I mean, just the 47% line, which has now gotten a lot of play. Is it something that, as someone who presumably pays income taxes, I'm assuming, that you feel that there's this problem that's developing in which people on the bottom half of the income distribution are not paying income taxes, and that's going to be a problem for the country?
Here's the problem, and Governor Romney said it, and your network, I heard many, including I think you and Rachel Maddow and others, were saying how Governor Romney was doubling down on thematically what he was saying there. And I'll tell you what, I will triple down on it this morning. Here is what, as he said, it was inelegant, but here's the point. The point is that this election, I believe, and I've been involved in this stuff for a long time, as all of you guys have, this election could not present a more stark contrast in governing philosophy. And on the one hand, as embodied in those remarks, you've got a current president who embodies who errs towards, at the very least, an entitlement society, a society of handouts, a society of 46 million people on food stamps. I think that compared to less than 10 over a decade ago. And that is a bad symptom for a society when there is more of that versus less of that. And Governor Romney, what he presents, I'm going to finish now. What he presents is he doesn't present redistribution, and you heard the president on tape on this one, even though I know you guys had a hard time authenticating it, but we heard it on tape. He advocates for redistribution as opposed to Governor Romney, which says, as do conservative economists and people like myself, say, we have a pie, let's make the pie bigger via growth. And the whole economic plan is driven towards growth.
Emil, I want you
as opposed towards redistribution.
I want you to hang on the line. We're going to take a quick break. There's some thoughts on the table here that want to respond to you. Stay with us. Emil, I want to just respond real quick on one factual thing on food stamps, because you're right that the amount of people that are on SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, has increased quite a bit. It was 32 million when the president took over. It's now around 46, 47 million. It just should be. It's really important to note that the last big expansion of eligibility for SNAP, which was part of the two things that have increased SNAP, are the recession. People have gotten poorer because of the recession, and a big expansion of eligibility. That expansion of eligibility happened in 2002, signed by President Bush, and the expansion of eligibility was voted for by none other than Paul Ryan. So the last major expansion of eligibility for food stamps happened under a Republican president, was voted for Paul Ryan, just as a kind of factual point to make. The other thing I want to ask you about is this redistribution thing. You said the president believes in redistribution, Mitt Romney doesn't believe in redistribution. And my question is, if that's the case, why doesn't he advocate a flat tax? And I've heard this from a bunch of Romney folks, if Mitt Romney doesn't believe in redistribution, then he's got the wrong tax plan. Because real belief in non-redistribution would be at the very least a flat tax, and I don't understand why he doesn't have the courage to go out there and actually advocate for a non-redistributive tax plan.
You know, actually, if you look at his tax plan very closely, it's about as close to a flat tax plan as has existed since the Reagan years. And what he's done is what he is advocating for is a highly simplified plan. The tax code, by the way, is 70,000 pages. 70,000. You know why it's 70,000 pages? Because for the last multiple decades, politicians have sold for donations, have sold exemptions to the code, and
like
Romney says,
for instance.
Let's simplify it. We can come to that one. Let's simplify it. Let's lower marginal rates, and let's get rid of not all of the, but most of the egregious exemptions. And in getting rid of the exemptions, as he says, taxes on the middle class will go down. And I've heard him say this 100 times. And I know this for a fact. He says taxes on rich folks are not going to go down because of the elimination of these exemptions.
Wait a second,
and the more people hear about this.
No, but that's intention. That's intention with the non-redistributive thing. If taxes on the rich, in order for the system to be totally non-redistributive, taxes on wealthy people have to come down. If he doesn't believe in redistribution, then he has to reduce the tax burden of wealthy people, right? Because we currently have a barely but progressive income tax. If he really doesn't believe in redistribution, he has to cut taxes for the wealthy. So those two things can't both be true. It cannot be the case that he is flattening the tax code and he is not cutting taxes for rich people.
If you're making, look, Chris, I always like talking with you because you think outside the box. If your point is that a progressive tax code, which is what the United States of America has, and it's the right thing, and it's about fairness and fairness of opportunity. If your point is that there is a technical element of redistribution by virtue of higher
not
income
just technical, actually,
payers paying, then
That's redistribution. It's not technical.
Let's be
You're paying for it.
Let's be
it's
real
not technical.
about it. Let's be real about this. When President Obama talks about redistribution, Chris, and you know this is true, when he talks about redistribution, he is talking about a massive difference from the Romney plan, which is about simpler, lower marginal rates, getting rid of exemptions, and lowering the corporate tax rate to attract business to America.
Okay, he was talking about it in 1998.
Just 2 points pre the commercial. One, it wasn't just you and Rachel Maddow that had a problem with Governor Romney's comments. I read Peggy Noonan, I read David Brooks, and everybody else. But with respect to the governor's comments on the 47%, we should just be clear and talk the facts. 60% of them pay payroll.
Right.
Okay. 30% are retirees and elderly, and the other 10% are students, military, disabled, and yes, those in poverty. So we should just be clear that on a percentage basis, my guess is a lot of that 47% pays higher than the 14% that Governor Romney just announced 2 days ago.
I want to agree with something that Emil Henry said. Okay, that this is a choice election. Mm-hmm. It certainly is. Okay, because what you're seeing, there was do you remember this textbook that they used to assign in college called "Who Built America"? It was a history of labor.
Yes.
In this election, we're turning that understanding completely upside down. Who built America? The people down in Lower Manhattan, finance capital. Okay, you and I are just so many moochers and looters.
This is the point. So we just got Mitt Romney's tax reform, right? And
tax returns,
and learned that he paid roughly 14 point something percent in income taxes. The lowest end of the bracket pays 17.1. So this whole notion of mooching is actually completely distorted in terms of the facts.
I want to thank Emil Henry. Emil, I'd love to get you at the table next time.
Can I jump in on that one?
Unfortunately, I am really sorry, but we do have to go to break. Okay. I'm up against a hard break. Thank you for coming. I'll have you back at the table. I really appreciate it.
We'll come to East Hampton.
Economic advisor to Mitt Romney, Robert Wolf, outside advisor to President Obama, and Thomas Frank, author of Pity the Billionaire. Maya Wiley from the Center for Social Inclusion. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
From ACT UP to Occupy, how change does come to Washington when we get back. On Thursday, President Obama made headlines during a Univision forum for stating something that seems to me undeniably true, that changing Washington can only happen from the outside. Occupy Wall Street, the most vibrant burst of extra-electoral activism in recent years, is based on that simple truth. While members of the media took the one-year anniversary of the Occupy movement this week as an opportunity to taunt the movement for its perceived failures, several hundred protesters staged a sit-in near the U.S. Stock Exchange in Lower Manhattan, where over 180 people were arrested. And on Friday, an amazing new documentary opened in theaters, chronicling a different, earlier extra-electoral social movement, one that is almost certainly the most successful of the past 30 years. How to Survive a Plague chronicles the rise and evolution of ACT UP, a group of AIDS activists who forced political and government elites to pay attention to them through militant, sustained, and targeted civil disobedience. They, too, were treated with utter contempt by media and political elites, derided as too radical and too juvenile to achieve real change. Here's the group protesting outside the FDA in October 1988.
Tested drugs in Europe, in Belgium, in France, in Germany, in England. We are not asking the FDA to release dangerous drugs without safety or efficacy. We are simply asking the FDA to do it quicker. We don't know where they're taking us. We're here because this government has the resources to deal with the AIDS epidemic, and they won't do it unless we force them.
Through a series of dramatic protests and with specific policy goals, ACT UP managed from the outside to fundamentally change the healthcare system in not only the United States but around the world, and save millions of lives in the process. Joining us now is Amin Hussein, an Occupy Wall Street activist, former Wall Street corporate lawyer, and editor of Title magazine. Back at the table, Alexis Goldstein, an Occupy Wall Street activist and former VP at Merrill Lynch and Deutsche Bank. David France, the writer, director, and producer of the new documentary How to Survive a Plague. And Garance, you've stayed with us from The Atlantic. And you're also featured in the film because before you were a political journalist, you were a member of ACT UP and very active in it. David, can I just start by saying I think the film is a masterpiece, and I just want everyone who's watching right now to do whatever it takes to go see it. It's just it's an incredible piece of work. I was just completely and totally overcome, really like emotionally, spiritually overcome by the film. It's a really, really beautiful piece of work. So thank you for
so
doing
much.
it. Now I'm going to give you the tough questions.
Okay, excellent.
Talk to me about what ACT UP was and why did it choose to be the kind of organization it was. There's this, one of the things I think is so interesting is we think about politics and we think about the election we're having now. If you're the member of a despised minority and a subsection of despised minority with a dreaded disease, you can't really run candidates for city council, right? Like, you're not going to have a majoritarian way of getting things done.
Right.
You have to choose another way. How did ACT UP develop their philosophy of how they were going to affect change?
I guess the first thing that we should remember was that an HIV diagnosis back then meant prognosis of just about 18 months. So everything was run on this kind of urgent campaign. There was no time to wait. By the 6th year of the epidemic, when ACT UP first formed, 6 years
1987, right?
1987, 6 years into this killer plague, there wasn't a single pill to take. I mean, the machinery of the National Health Services hadn't produced anything. People were just dying left and right. So what ACT UP did when it came together as a spontaneous movement was to immediately just begin to press on or knock or hammer on all the doors, whereas any one of which might have produced some sort of a response, a medical response, a pill, a treatment, any sort of a treatment. And they knowing that they had this broad campaign, they were fighting the media that was paying no attention. They were fighting pharma that didn't think that there was any money in manufacturing AIDS medications. The NIH, the FDA, the CDC, it was a battle on so many fronts that they just diversified. They said, you pick whatever struggle you want, as long as the goal is our goal, which is drugs into bodies, treatment for people.
And these very, there's Mayor Koch is George H.W. Bush, the president. Right. The basically nameless, probably well-intentioned bureaucrats at the National Institutes of Health. I mean, and sometimes you get these reaction shots, and these folks who, these are not like the enemy. When you think about like who is the enemy, it's like scientists, the NIH, who are trying to solve diseases, right? But they're showing up at their door. Garance, I want to talk about demands, because it seemed to me that, and that gets into this Occupy question, right? These actions seem to have very specific demands. I mean, there's one action that's in the film where they go to St. Vincent, where a security guard had beaten up a few gay and lesbian patients. And they're going, and they said, we're going, and we demand a meeting, and we demand a denunciation of violence against gay people. And we're going to occupy until we get it, and then someone comes out and gives them a very specific kind of demand. How crucial was that to the strategy?
It was absolutely essential, and I think if you look at ACT UP, it was the last of the great new social movements of the 20th century, and it had members who came from all the ones that had existed previously and who brought their skill set to the table, as well as many people who had no previous activism experience who came in just because of AIDS and HIV. But in terms of how change was created, I think now we see activists organizing online, sort of flash mob style on Facebook and so on. And ACT UP didn't do anything accidentally. It believed in research. So the first step was identifying a need. The second step was research. The third step was contact with whoever you wanted change from. A list of demands was always sent in advance. There was a request for meetings in advance to see if something could be resolved without a protest. So the protest was a tool in a broad spectrum of actions that were taken, and then obviously there was follow-up after protests as well. And so there was always a conversation and always an opportunity that people were trying to give whoever they were targeting.
Right. So we want X from you, Mayor Koch, which is increased funding for AIDS services at the municipal hospitals. Exactly. We want a meeting to talk about it. No meeting. Okay, we're going to show up at your front door. Okay, we have this demand. I want you guys to weigh in on this, because I think one of the sort of novel aspects of the way Occupy as a social movement was structured was this lack of demands, right? This rejection of demands explicitly. And I got to say that I found that difficult to square with my studying previous social movements. And then watching the film, I was reminded of how crucial demands seem. And so I want to ask you guys how you can have social movement progress without demands right after we take this break.
We're from ACT UP New York.
We're here
basically to demand that you start to develop this drug as a potentially life-saving therapy for people with breast cancer and Kaposi sarcoma.
You already have the blood of several thousand people on your hands, and those of us like me who have Kaposi sarcoma are going to die, and we are here until we get arrested.
We have helped many companies through this process. We can take a drug from your test tube to the market in under 2 years if you work with us, and we will pave the way for you with the Food and Drug Administration. But this total reluctance on your part is going to get you nowhere. It'll end up killing us, all right?
See this dark mark on my forehead? That's Kaposi sarcoma. It's going to spread. It's going to kill me. You're coming to my funeral because you're the man responsible. You are my murderer in your shirt and tie.
Really intense scene from sitting at Daiichi Pharmaceutical. Garance makes an appearance there. I left with this question about the first thing they say is we are here to demand, very specific demand. How do you respond to that when Occupy has sort of made this decision to reject the ideology of demands?
I mean, this is a 21st movement, a 21st century social movement, and we, in August of last year, had discussions back and forth about this. How do you address social, political, and economic injustice all together? Occupy is part of a continuum of social movements in the 21st century. The struggle that ACT UP launched hasn't ended. Right. And it's part of that struggle within Occupy. And what we're trying to do right now is create space for many social struggles that are in existence right now in different groups that are better situated to make those demands. And in those situations, we stand in solidarity and provide bodies and develop analysis. And the idea that a year in right now, we're coming up with this analysis and we're rolling it out for people. But we should be mindful that how do you deal with mafia capitalism, which is social, political, and economic injustice that's pervasive in all our institutions and structures at a time when our government is incapable of dealing with the grip of global capital?
And I would just add to that. I mean, we're looking for transformational change. We're not looking for transactional change. But I would also say that we do use the tactics of ACT UP, and we have learned and we continue to try to learn from our elders and from those who came before. And we have affinity groups, and this is a structure that worked really well on Monday, where we had these sort of decentralized actions, where we had 4 different zones, autonomous actions, autonomous affinity groups, and people had demands. People took bank lobbies, actions that I've been a part of. The sit-in at Attorney General Schneiderman's office, we had demands to hold a public forum, and quite fortuitously you sort of provided that for us quite by coincidence. But we have demands in these individual affinity groups, the people trying to shut down the Spectra pipeline, but as a larger movement we don't speak with a single voice for a single demand.
But this gets to this question, and I'll come back to you here, right, which is that how do you deal with what you call mafia capitalism, or how do you deal with this sort of broad structure of socio-political inequality, right? And the answer, I don't have the answer, but the first step in the answer is breaking it into smaller problems, right? I mean, I think that's what you do as a computer programmer, right? Like, how am I going to program Tetris? Well, first, how do I draw a little block on the screen? And breaking up into smaller problems was part of what made ACT UP very effective. I mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it had more than 40 different committees, and it wasn't just ACT UP New York, which was the big one and the first one, but there were ACT UPs all over the country. There was the whole ACT Now network. It became an international movement. And each of those committees dealt with a very broad array of issues and also gave rise to other organizations which I think still exist and which is important that people know. Housing Works was 4 people from the ACT UP Housing Committee. The Lower East Side Needle Exchange Project began as a civil disobedience action, basically doing needle exchange when it was still illegal, and then ACT UP got the law changed in New York State around that. And then the Treatment Action Group, which is featured in the movie, which continues to do work on AIDS treatment policy, and then the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition, which also continues to do work on vaccine policy.
That's the long run, really. I mean, that's what ultimately 10 years and 15 years of AIDS activism produced. But in the first year, ACT UP wasn't all that remarkably dissimilar to what Occupy accomplished over its first year. It began as in opposition to the government,
like just a creative core,
just right out on the street, just protesting, being arrested. The tactics were really similar, and it took a long time, as you see in the movie, which covers 9 years. It took a long time for the development of a really refined strategy for the very specific goals that they had ahead of them.
That's very interesting.
And that refined strategy began to include the development of self-education in the scientific sphere, where people became so well versed in the science, and this is one of the areas where Garance did her work in ACT UP, that they were able not only just to speak the language of the people that they were asking for, who they were asking for change from, but were able to actually join them and help develop those changes together. And then Housing Works and all those other aspects which developed in response to this kind of broadening idea of the need for change.
And I feel like that's some of the things that we're starting to see out of Occupy. You see people self-educating about this disease that's affecting them. We're releasing things like the Debt Resisters Operations Manual, which is a very well-researched, anonymously put out guide to debt, to bankruptcy, to how the system works for people who are affected by it.
I think, the power of expertise and the power of being able to chip away at expertise with your own self-education is, I think, a really common theme. We'll take a quick break. Be right back. Talking about ACT UP, Occupy Wall Street, and how social change happens. And Amin, you had something you want to say.
One of the lessons from ACT UP was direct action. And that's what we did on September 17 last year. Occupying a public space where there aren't spaces of public dissent was a direct action. Now, what do you get out of direct action? People empowerment. At an age, at a time when people seem powerless. And it's important to free up imagination to think that there is another world that's possible, that there's another way of organizing socio-political economic life that isn't about Republican, Democrat, and Independent, where people get lost in the shuffle. Right? And the other thing I want to say is, we do our research. Power of the powerless, right? Jeremy Brecker writing a piece, ACT UP, 1989, die-in, right? At the stock exchange a week ago, that's where we were. We're studying the civil rights movement and we're studying other movements, but the challenges are different. And I think, chain of equivalences, multiple social movements, more like South America, where you have a social movement that continues past putting people in power, bringing about change, because this is long-term. And the other thing that I want to mention about the occupation last year in September 17 was started as a direct action, became a way of life, and the epicenter of a greed culture. A society of mutual aid.
And you see that if you watch your film was the best cinematic portrayal of a social movement since, I think, Eyes on the Prize. And Eyes on the Prize is the sort of classic miniseries documentary on the civil rights movement. And you see in both cases, and in Occupy, a culture emerges right around the process
of the creation of a community.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the central lesson for me of ACT UP is actually sort of contrary to one of the sort of big concepts that we're talking about today. There's the whole It Gets Better project, the idea that if you just sort of reach out and talk to someone across internet space, you can improve their lives and people can just wait and things will improve. But that's not how the world works. And I think the central lesson of ACT UP is that nothing gets better unless you make it. And that it's very difficult work. I think a lot of the people who were in the group, they devoted years to it, and it was very difficult work for people to be the sharp edge of the spear in a way. But that's how social change happens in this country, in a free society where there is a capacity for people to hold their government accountable, and people take the initiative to do that.
And I think
they can make that happen. And then politicians basically act to ratify those social changes once they reach a certain kind of tipping point.
I was just going to say, I think because it's such hard work, you see these communities form to take care of one another. And that's one of my favorite things about Occupy. After S17 this past Monday, on Tuesday, we had people in the courts, at the jails, and people would come out, and we'd be sitting in the court, and once people got out, you can't talk in the courtroom, you go outside, and if you were still in the courtroom, you hear this roar. Because there are so many people there waiting for people to get out of jail. You need a cigarette, you need some food, and it's this culture of care.
And this is one of the things here is that the film is incredibly dramatic, and it condenses 10 years into about an hour and 45 minutes, I want to say. And what can get lost in that is that, social movement change is a lot of tedium. In Parting the Waters, which is the amazing first in the Taylor Branch trilogy about the civil rights movement, there are 60-page accounts of meetings. There's a great Oscar Wilde quote about this, right? The problem with socialism is that it takes up too many meetings. But meetings are what change the world. All right, what you should know for the news week ahead coming up next. just a moment, what we should know for the news week ahead. But first, an update on a story we've been following closely here on Up. Speaking of self-education and expertise. Okay, a key player on the Federal Reserve and one of the board's biggest inflation hawks, that is, someone inordinately worried about high inflation rather than high unemployment, now sees the virtue of using monetary stimulus to fight unemployment. In a speech on Thursday, Narayana Kocherlakota, got that right, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minnesota, laid out what he called a contingency plan for liftoff for the economy. Kocherlakota said the Fed should keep the Fed funds rate extraordinarily low until the unemployment rate has fallen below 5.5%. Finally, it sounds like even the Fed's biggest skeptics of monetary stimulus are coming around to the idea the board should get more aggressive on the jobs crisis. That is very welcome news. And a quick personal update, if you're in the New York City area, I'll be appearing at 1 p.m. today at the Brooklyn Book Festival to talk about my new book, Twilight of the Elites. Go to brooklynbookfestival.org for more information. So what should you know for the week coming up? You should know that the Democratic Senate has been sent a bill by the Republican House called the Stop the War on Coal Act. You should know that according to Democrats on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Stop the War on Coal Act is the 302nd bill passed by the Republican House this year alone to include provisions endangering our land, water, and air by weakening anti-pollution rules, the EPA, and existing protections for coastal areas and public lands. You should know that in a Republican Senate led by a longstanding friend of coal industry polluters, this bill would have a much better chance of sailing through. And you should know that the battle for control of Congress may have as much to do with the future of the country as the presidential race does. You should know that you should know what Tim Pawlenty will be doing with himself now after being passed over to be on the GOP ticket. He stepped down this week as the Romney campaign co-chair to become CEO of the Financial Services Roundtable, which is one of the most powerful industry groups in Washington, representing the interests of Wall Street and fighting tooth, nail, and claw against any and all regulatory incursions that might reduce the power or profitability of the financial sector. According to reports, Pawlenty's salary could be in the ballpark of $2 million a year, and you should know he joins a long list of former politicians, Democrat and Republican, who have cashed out after leaving office to peddle their influence on behalf of big money. You should know this is a very big part of why Washington is broken and why Barack Obama was 100% right when he said it can't be changed from the inside. Mr. Pawlenty, welcome to the inside. And finally, you should know that the activist, innovator, and writer Aaron Swartz will now have to defend himself against 13 felony counts after prosecutors unsealed additional indictments against him this week. Swartz, who I should disclose is a friend, is accused of using his access to the MIT library to download millions of academic articles from an online database in order to make them available to the public for free. Now, the database is run by a nonprofit which charges fees for accessing the articles to cover the cost of making them available to the public. You should know that Swartz is being charged under a 26-year-old law intended to stop hackers from damaging computers or stealing private information, and that the charges against Swartz include using a fake email address and violating terms of service, those little boxes you check to say you've read them even though you haven't. According to Wired magazine, a federal court this year found that the same law could implicate millions of Americans as criminals. But you should know that in the age of the corporate wars over information, that isn't stopping federal prosecutors from pushing ahead with their case against Swartz. And if he's convicted, hitting him with a $1 million fine and as much as 50 years in prison, all for the crime of making public academic information accessible to the public. I want to find out what my guests think we should know for the week coming up. And let's begin with you, Amin.
Well, you should know that Occupy Wall Street is in year 2, and it's still alive. And as part of a new initiative, it's focusing on debt, and it has launched Strike Debt. And part of what Strike Debt is doing is rolling out a people's bailout, where we'll be purchasing debt, defaulted debt, medical debt, cents on the dollar, and abolishing it as a way of delivering wins for the people.
This is an amazing thing you guys are doing. I want people to understand what's happening. Defaulted debt is essentially auctioned off. And because it's being auctioned off, because people are in arrears, you can buy it at auction at cents on the dollar. And so your plan is to go to these actual auctions and say, oh, this is $100,000 in medical debt. We're going to buy it for $10,000, and turn around to the person who owes that money and say, we forgive the debt.
Right off. And what's important out of that is we want people to understand that when you owe $100, it's being bought and sold by Wall Street, and you actually owe cents on the dollar. And that's how we get rid of that shame that's binding the 99%.
Alexis Goldstein.
Go to strikedebt.org to find out more about that. You should know that ACT UP has been meeting in the LGBT Center for 25 years, and you can join them. There's a meeting this Monday. It's earlier than usual. It's at 6:30 p.m. So if you're in New York, it's at 13th Street and 7th Avenue. And you should also know about a wonderful project called the Radical Resistance Tour for people crisscross the country. Talk to activists, West Virginia, East Texas. Go to radicalresistancetour.tumblr.com.
What should folks know?
People should know that this week, for the first time in the 30-year AIDS epidemic, you can take HIV tests at home. The FDA just approved the home HIV tests.
Wow.
There are some 300,000 Americans who don't know if they're HIV positive or negative. They haven't gone for tests. This makes it accessible to everybody, and it's going to be a major tool in reducing the spread of the disease.
That's great. Garance.
You should know that we are on October 2nd going to be getting a ruling in Pennsylvania on the voter suppression law, the toughest in the country. And I think this law, actually, I'm starting to hear that it's having effects on the elderly also, who do not have passports, who lost their birth certificate from 1930, who need more documentation than they've got.
We're going to be tracking that. I want to thank my guests today, Amin Hussein of Title Magazine and Occupy Wall Street, Alexis Goldstein, also with Occupy Wall Street, filmmaker David France. The new documentary is called How to Survive a Plague. See it, see it, see it, see it. And Garance Frank-Karuta of The Atlantic Magazine, and also featured in How to Survive a Plague. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us today. And for one full year from now, this weekend marks our 1-year anniversary. So we put up a little blooper reel of me from the early days. It's online right now at up.msnbc.com. I'm sure I'll provide more fodder in this year as well. We'll be back next weekend, Saturday and Sunday at 8 Eastern Time. Our guests will include Jeffrey Toobin on what his new book reveals about the Supreme Court and President Obama, and former FDIC Chief Sheila Bair. Coming up next is a special episode of Melissa Harris Perry on today's MHP, a student town hall as part of NBC's Education Nation Summit from the New York Public Library in Manhattan. And stay with NBC for more of Education Nation as NBC nightly news anchor Brian Williams comes to MSNBC for a special teacher town hall at noon Eastern. That's NBC's Education Nation here on MSNBC, starting with Melissa Harris Perry coming up next. And we will see you next week here on Up.